Kia ora, everyone. Today's session is all about being a chairperson. I don't know about you, but I seem to spend quite a bit of my life being chairpersons of organisations, and I'm pretty sure I was voluntold to be most of those roles. And a lot of the chair people I work with in governance organisations kind of find that they end up in that situation just by default without really thinking about what it is that it means to be a chair or how to be an effective chair. And most of the chairpersons I work with actually walk around quite often feeling quite guilty, that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing on their boards. They're not able to give the time that they feel like they should be giving on a board. And I spend a lot of time coaching people looking at, well, what does it mean to be a good chairperson and what are your roles and responsibilities? So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Let's make that big. And we do have a little bit of a plan for tonight. We're going to have a look at the chairperson as a leader. What does that mean? And I'm going to share with you a framework, the 4 key roles of a chairperson. And I really like this framework because it kind of describes what your roles and responsibilities are as a chair. Just helps us to make a little bit more sense of what it is we're doing. We're going to check in on effective meetings and what they look like. As most chairpersons, that's principally their key role, is to facilitate meetings. And also, quite often as chairpersons, we by default end up being the manager or the key staff person, support person. So we're just going to look at that for a short while. And then we're actually going to have a look at looking after ourselves as chairpersons. Because like I said, a lot of the people I work with walk around feeling quite guilty because they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. They're putting a lot of hours into it, and the balance between their day job and being a chairperson sometimes gets a bit askew. So I'm actually going to pop you into breakout rooms, just have a conversation with a couple of people about why you put your hand up for the role as chairperson if you are a chairperson. And if you are not a chairperson, maybe you could talk about other roles you have had in organisations as chair. But also I want you to have a conversation, how did you learn to be a chairperson? Where did you get the tools? Where did you get the knowledge and the understanding from? Yeah? And we've had Darwin and Joseph join us since you were all away. Just thinking about why we put our hand up to be on the chairperson of a board and where we learn our job. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share? Did anybody receive official training?
No, I think I learned by watching other chairs over the years and seeing how they do the job.
Yep. So we learn our job by watching others. Anyone else?
I did.
Yeah.
Joe, I got a training program put together by the Play Centre Association for all new chairs. Was something they did every year.
Yeah. And Play Centre responsible for the training of a lot of people in New Zealand, yeah? Including some politicians got their first taste of committees and being leaders in the Play Centre.
I did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like Jenny.
Yeah, that's right. So for the most part, we just learn on the job, or we have some type of orientation. Most organisations are not as organised as Play Centre and have training programs, although they're a national organisation, so they have the resources and the strategy to do that. Yeah. So what I'm going to share with you is a model that helps us to make sense of our job. And just want to check in with this too, that although the board is collectively responsible for what happens in our organisation, the chair has the responsibility to lead. Yeah. So this is usually an unwritten tenet of not-for-profit governance, that the chair or the co-chairs, if there's more than one chair, has the responsibility to lead. So
Andy, I've lost you.
Who's?
Rosemary, I've lost the whole thing. I've got post attendee. I've clicked something wrong. How do I go back?
Okay, Rosemary, we still have you, and we can still see you, so you're still with us.
Okay.
You're probably kind of hiding.
Oh, I'm back.
All right. Okay. All right. We've got Rosemary back. Okay. So we have this model that we really like called the Chair's 4C, Compass 4Cs. And what it does is it splits the chair's role into 4. and gives 4 focuses for chairpersons to think about when you're designing, well, what is my role and what is my responsibility? And it is clarity, to provide clarity of purpose to the board. It's to build a cohesive board, to develop constructive relationships both inside the organisation and outside the organisation, and also to make sure that there's considered decision making. So for the next half hour, we're just going to look at each of these roles and explore what they look like. So the first one is about clarity of purpose. We know that boards who are really clear about the direction and what it is that they're trying to achieve have really focused meetings and managed to stay on track. So it's not just about having a really good strategic plan, but it is making sure that you have a strategic plan, but really knowing what your vision is and what your reason for existing is. And so that's the difference that you want to make in the world. So clarity of purpose is about knowing why we exist as a board and what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I think the big question for boards or for chairpersons is, how do we know that the rest of our board shares the same vision as we do as chairpersons? So I think it's a really good question for us to ask, is how do I know that the rest of my board shares my vision? So most times we do this at annual strategic planning or at check-in times. And some people go, oh yeah, but the vision's written on a piece of paper, we can all see it. But I can tell you from experience that we all interpret that quite differently. And it's not necessary that everybody on the board can recite the vision exactly the same, but it is really useful for us to hear how we all interpret that vision. Because if we hear how we all interpret that vision, then we get to understand why we take the stance that we do in discussions and why we push certain agendas during discussions, if we get to understand how we're all coming at what we're trying to do. So our first job as chairpersons is to have clear vision, clear purpose, and a pretty good understanding of how everyone interprets that. If we don't have clear purpose, we can experience what we call mission drift. And sometimes we call this funder capture as well. And what this is that organizations will start to move away from what it is they're trying to achieve and be influenced mainly by funders or for others. And we talk about organizations sticking to their knitting. And I'll give you a couple of examples of mission drift that I've experienced. I was working with an organization north of Auckland, who were an environment group and were having a lot of conflict in their board. And so I came in to work with them, and we did quite a bit of just talking and unpacking and trying to work out what was going on. And what we discovered was that when the organisation had been set up about 10 years earlier, they had come together as a group of people because they were passionate about environmental restoration using organic processes. So what they were doing was going out into reserves and teaching people how to do weed eradication organically. That was their passion. Anyway, they had been doing it for a few years, and their local council offered them some funding to help them do what they do. So they gratefully took that funding, and it was really great. And that carried on for a couple of years. And then a few years down the track, the council said to them, well, you know what, we have this weed killer that we distribute to people in our area who are trying to eradicate weeds. Do you think you could tell the people you work with that the council has this weed killer for free? So the board thought about it, and they thought, oh, there's no harm in that, even though we're quite passionate about organic approaches. So they started to tell the people that they're working with, if you want some of this product, this is where you can get it. It's not our cup of tea, but it's up to you. Then if things continued, and then a few years down the track, the council came to them and said, we'd like you to store this product at your centre so that people can come and collect it from you. And at that point, they realised that they were receiving their principal funding from the council, and to say no meant they were biting the hand that fed them. So they said, okay. A few years down the track, they're all in conflict, because what they had done was they had drifted off from what their original intention was, which was to teach people organic means of weed control. And that caused the rift in their organisation. So we call that mission drift, when we start to do what other people want us to do rather than what we wanted to do. And it's mostly funders that can do this. I was working with another organisation who were doing art therapy, and the Ministry of Health said that they had to have some consultants on their board. They were all consumers, and either they found a couple of consultants, and I ended up being one, or the Ministry of Health would come and sit on their governance board. So that's another example of mission drift, because if you have Ministry of Health on their governance board, then the Ministry of Health is starting to push their policy agenda and the work that's done. So it's just something to keep an eye out. And if we are clear on why we exist and what we're trying to achieve, then we know what we can say no to, yeah? Because actually sometimes it's okay to say no to funders and to people who want to join us and to partner with them, because it means that we could be detracted from what we're trying to do. I'm just going to also, didn't mention before, that if you have any questions, just pop them in chat. Keep an eye on chat and let me know if anyone has any questions. I'm just going to mute you, Rosemary, because we've got background noise from you. So I have included this tool in your handout, and this is a decision-making tool by a chap called Brinkerhoff from the States. So it's a little bit American-y, but I really like it because it gives us a flow chart that if we're making a decision, how do we make sure that our decision keeps us on track for what we're trying to achieve? And so that's why the number one question when you're making a decision is, does this action support our mission? Or is it sending us off in another direction? Does it keep us focused on our priorities? Do we have enough information to actually make a decision? And have we applied appropriate analysis? And finally, have we consulted appropriately with our stakeholders? So this is a really useful tool to keep in front of you as a chairperson when you're working your way through a decision-making process. Like I said, it's quite American, so you probably want to change the language a little bit. And not every question or decision you make will require a business analysis, but it's in there anyway. So that's just a tool for you to use. The second role of a chairperson is to build a cohesive board. And building a cohesive board is really the same as building a team, so that we have a group of people who are collectively being responsible and a group of people who are making sure that decisions are made from multiple perspectives. If we didn't have a group of people working together, then we would just have one person. It would be yeah, a little bit of a dictatorship, I guess, and it wouldn't really be community-led. It would be that one person-led. And that's why we have boards, to represent community and different community perspectives. So it's, building a cohesive board really is the same things that we do around building a team, yeah? And making sure that we use everybody's skills and everybody's strengths, and we've got everybody on board with the values and what we're trying to do. So the first thing about building a cohesive board is making sure that we have the right people in the first place. So that's in the recruitment process. It's just checking out why people want to join your board, and also just having conversations with them to see if they match up with your values. And sometimes I call this working out if you're from the same tribe. Yeah, like you're looking for your tribe to come together so that you can all work together on this issue. Some of you have been on boards that there's been quite a bit of conflict. Sometimes it works down to that there's a bit of a values misalignment, yeah? And it's quite easy to work that out. So find the right people in the first place. Also be really clear about the roles and responsibilities of the person on your board. So I've been on boards when I've been there like a whole year and I'm really not quite sure why I'm there. Like, what's my job? Am I there to help make decisions? Am I there to represent the community I've come from? And quite often where there's conflict between board members and between the board and the workers of an organisation, it's because of this lack of clarity. So this doesn't have to be job descriptions written. This could just be a conversation that you have often as a board. But I do recommend that you do have some kind of written job description that outlines the expectations, especially because sometimes when we recruit people onto our board, often it's nominations will come from the floor, or we'll just tell people, oh yeah, well, come and join us on this board. You don't have to do anything, you just have to come to meetings. Yeah. But actually having something written so that people know what they can expect is really, really useful. thing about being a chair is about really keeping your board members informed about what's going on. So quite often as a chairperson, we get to hear what's going on first. We get to hear what's going on in depth because we've got the relationship more often with the workers than the rest of the board. So the rest of the board might be just rocking up once a month, but quite often as chairpersons, we're either coming in every day or talking to the manager every day or talking with the teams once a week. So really important to keep the board informed of what's going on so that when they get to the meetings, they're not like, what are you talking about? What's happening? And a lot of you would have felt this over the last 6 weeks, yeah? That just more ongoing communication was needed between the board and the staff. So also we talk about providing training as well. So one of the ways that we can help to embed people into their roles and responsibilities is actually to provide training for them. So what you're doing right now, this type of governance training, just helps to clarify for people what their expected responsibilities are and what they can expect being on a board. So the thing about being on a board is that we want to utilize everybody's strengths, and to do that we really have to get to know each other. And also if we want to build that team cohesion, we have to get to know each other and really learn what kind of perspectives we have on issues. We have to learn about each other's backgrounds so we know when we're sharing stories where those stories are coming from. So the key success to actually having a highly functioning board is actually getting to know each other. So I'm going to pop you back into rooms to have this conversation. How well does your board know each other? And what are some ways that we can get our boards to get to know each other? So let's see if we can come up with a brainstorm of different ways that we can help our boards to get to know each other, things we only meet once a month or 4 times a year. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'll put these questions, send them out to you when you're in your rooms. And I'm going to pop you back into breakout rooms. I think that's everyone back. So just wondering if anyone had any great ideas for how we can get our boards to know each other. Just going to invite you just to speak up actually, because I've got a couple of screens of you, so it's a bit hard for me to see.
Go.
Let's go with Bev. Bev?
No, Sandy, I should be Nolan on the screen.
Oh, sorry. No.
Because it's probably you're thinking now, who's Bev? I've never seen him on the screen. It's just come up, I think, because Bev was in there.
Hey, Nolan, did your group come up with anything interesting?
Ah, that's very good. Thank you, Sandy.
Yeah, no worries. Any volunteers to share what their group talked about? Christine.
I can. Yeah. Hi. A few things that were discussed. Some more formal ideas was to post people's CVs online so we can access that kind of, which was really interesting. And then kind of the informal team building things, perhaps getting together for a training. And we talked about the importance of that relationship building and trust building.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Christine. Anyone else? Marjorie. You have to unmute yourself, Marjorie. Oh, I'll unmute you, Marjorie.
There, done it.
Okay.
Okay. Jan, who I was speaking with, she comes from a very small community, and they all know each other anyway, and they do social things all the time, once a month and so on. With where I'm at, apart from social activities that we are involved with, I've often found that if 3 or 4 of you could get together to do a task together, doesn't matter what it is. I'm at the theatre, so it could be 3 or 4 of us working with the wardrobe, or 3 or 4 of us in the kitchen doing something and so on. And, the chatter goes around, and you're just in an ordinary situation, and you chat, and it's one way of getting to know each other without having to do anything formal or making people feel uncomfortable.
Lovely. So just shared tasks. Thanks,
Yes.
Margie. Anyone else?
It made me realise that we haven't done anything.
Mhm.
And I was with Nigel and Bart, and they talked about things like having, when they meet physically, having dinner before the meeting.
Yep.
And getting together for planning days. And so it's something we've been so engaged in just trying to get this thing off the ground. We hadn't even thought of it, but it's good now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. That's right. And it's amazing just sharing food together, yeah? And quite often we have board meetings in the evening. People are coming straight after work. So actually nourishing people and sharing kai together is a good idea. Sophia's talked about us having social stuff and codes of conduct. And Rosemary in chat is suggesting that it's the chairperson's role to make sure that people aren't left out of the informal gatherings, yeah? Just keeping an eye on some of the people who are finding out, that perhaps aren't included as much as others. Some things that some boards do is have annual retreats, like go away together for a couple of days once a year and do strategic planning. So there's nothing like going away for the night together that helps people to get to know each other really well. And also I think what you've come is quite correct, either formal and informal ways. Just having a cup of coffee when someone new comes on board is really important, just to find out where they're coming from and asking that question of each other often. Why did you join this board? Like really getting people's motivation. So the more we understand each other and the more robust our discussions can be, and the more we can contradict each other during decision making as well, if we've got high levels of trust. So we can't trust people in conversation and debate if we don't understand each other. And can I say that part of being on a board for a lot of people is the social dimension of being on a board. No one really joins a board because they want to practice making decisions and be responsible for employees, and it's not why we join. We join because we want to make a difference in the world and we want to do that with other people. So really important we foster relationships.
Excuse me, because we're a community marae, and we're family, so we sort of have our meetings that sort of are at the same time as significant things through our, for instance, we have a meeting on Waitangi. So we sort of have that as a celebration first, and then on the Sunday we have our trustees meeting, so that we can sort of, how did that, including the family, have a bit of fun, and then at the end of it have a trustees meeting.
And I think you make a good point, Rhonda, about trustees or board members being in celebrations together, celebrating with others in the organisation and their communities. I think it's a good time for us to socialise and get together. Thank you. So team, I'm just going to move on. Just got an eye on the time. So one suggestion a few of you have heard me talk about in other sessions is about developing a matrix to gather everyone's strengths and just getting a really good understanding of everyone in the board. What is their governance skills? Like who's really experienced at governance and can perhaps support those people on the board. This is their first time on a board. Who's got what interpersonal skills? Like who's really good at resolving conflict? Who's really good at public speaking? And just working out which members have those skills so that we can draw on them. Making sure that we have a diverse board. So that's in terms of culture and gender. And sometimes it's also, if we're a large board from a bigger region, making sure that we're from all different parts of the region. Just also knowing what people's general experience is in work, or the skills that they bring from work or from family. And also their sector-specific knowledge. So, for example, I'm one of the people on an organisation called ECPAT Child Alert, which is about the trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. So knowing who on the board has specific knowledge around that issue that we can draw on. So to build a really robust team is we've got to know where everyone's strengths are so we can draw on each other at all times. So the third dimension of a chairperson's role is to build constructive relationships. And there's two areas that we build constructive relationships. One is internally and the other is externally. So the external relationships we have is with our funders or with the other people from our community, with the media, with other organisations. An internal relationship tends to be that board manager partnership. So organisations who don't have paid managers usually have a key person or a key volunteer or a key board member that is principally leads the work. So making sure that the board and that person have a really good partnership. So this is usually one of the defaults, leadership defaults of the chairperson, is to nurture relationships. So when it comes to external relationships, it's really good for boards to actually know who your stakeholders are. So that's simply asking the question, who are our stakeholders? And everybody doing a brainstorm. And some stakeholders will be really close to your organisation. You'll work with them a lot, like for example, local iwi, or maybe if you're in an environment group working with DOC, could be your funders. And also the question that boards need to ask themselves is, how much time do you spend discussing outside the boundaries of the organisation? So in your meetings, do you only focus on what's happening in the organisation, or do you have conversations about what's going on out there in our community and what others are doing and how can we connect with others? So boards that really do well in their governance role are really aware that all of our organisations are interconnected and should really foster that and foster collaborations and collective action. And what we have found out since COVID and what's coming up for us in the future is the more we collaborate, the more impact we can have for communities, particularly with what's ahead for us. So having a look at your agenda and how you carry out your discussions, do you make sure that you have time to talk about what's going on out there? And so I really encourage chairpersons to get their board members out there as well, out there in the community. And the reason why we do this is for people to see that your organisation is led by a board. It's not just the staff, or it's not just the chairperson, but actually this is a whole group of people who are leading this activity in these programs. And that actually gives people a lot more trust in your organisation, particularly if you have paid staff. Because it's when it's paid staff going out there being champions for your organisation, people think, well, of course you're saying that because, you know, you're employed by that group. But when a volunteer board member gets out there and does a presentation or talks about your organisation, you have a lot more credos in terms of what you're saying because you're doing it as a volunteer. And also, of course, the more your board members are out there, the more they're understanding what's going on in the community, making sure that you're meeting the needs of community. So probably the biggest role that a chairperson has aside from meeting management is actually this partnership with the manager. So this is just a quote, and in this model they talk about CEOs, but like I said, the CEO is the manager or the key person. And if governance is an art, then the relationship between the organisation board and that person is a delicate dance. So quite often you'll see models written about governance where it says this is the board's job and this is the manager's job, and everyone has to be really clear, not mix up the two, and then everyone will live happily ever after. It's a nice idea, but in reality that's not what happens. That there is a lot of overlap between the roles and responsibilities between the two, and actually it is a partnership. So some governance models say the board should just be hands off and let the staff or the manager get on with the job. But actually, in organisations of most of the size that you work in, that you need to be working a lot closer together than that. And it sometimes is a delicate dance. So what this looks like in practice, this delicate dance, is making sure that it's clear and agreed who is responsible for what. So it's about knowing where the overlaps are as well. And that's okay to have overlaps, things that you're working on together as a board and staff. It's about being clear what the board wants the manager to report on. So quite often the boards I work with, there's a lot of conflict around the reports that come to them. And boards don't realise actually that you are responsible for saying what you want those reports to include. And actually directing your managers and your staff to say, this is the information we need for us to be able to function. And giving your staff a template to report on and knowing what level of detail you want, which means that in your meetings, if you have the type of report you want, written report you want, then you can spend less time going through that. And of course, part of the dance is providing good supervision, support and review of the manager. Like, who is responsible for that? How is it done and when is it done? And I work with a lot of not-for-profit managers who never have performance appraisals with anyone on their board. The board just say, but you're doing a great job, we don't need to sit down and do an appraisal. But performance appraisals are not just about monitoring how well someone's doing, it's actually about providing coaching and support for people. So a couple of really good questions for boards to ask is, what does your partnership look like? And what could you do to make it even more effective? And also having conversations just as a board without that key person in the room as well, so that you can openly and honestly talk about, yeah, how you can support that person without them having to listen to them being discussed in the third person. So possibly like the most important relationship is between the staff and the board. The fourth area that we need to think about as chairpersons, one of our key roles, is to make sure that decision making is really well considered and that sound decisions are made all the time, so that you don't have to revisit issues and go back and repeat what you've already decided in the past, because at the time you had a really good process in place. So I'm just going to share with you, oh yeah, this it's about anti-good meetings really. Is your decision making a Ouija board? Yeah, is there one sky strong guiding hand? Is it the lowest common denominator compromise? Do we have patterns of past meetings and decision making happen? And is it the whims of passing breezes or urges? So this is the opposite of what we want, yeah? We want everybody involved in making the decision. We want a good consensus process in place. And if we've had bad decision making processes in the past, we don't repeat them. We make sure that we're putting good processes in place. And also that we have agendas with clear objectives that we're trying to achieve, that it's not just what everybody feels like doing at the time. So I'm going to pop you back in groups. You've heard enough from me. I just want you to talk about in your groups this time about when you've been in a meeting where there was really good decision making happening. So just share a couple of stories. What made that decision making effective? What made it possible? And what conditions were in place? So have a conversation about where there was really good decision making happening and how did it happen? What could you as chairperson put in place to make sure your decision making is really well? So I'm going to stop sharing and pop you back into groups. And just maybe one or two of you will have time to share. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to call on each room to take a turn sharing what they felt made the decision-making process go so well and what makes a robust decision-making process. So first of all, we're going to call on breakout room 1, which was Anilatu, Bruce and Christine. One of you want to share with us your conversation?
I took notes, so I'll go. We talked about making sure that you have enough information before you start think about your decision, and to make sure that you have enough time to think about it. So if do a lot of research before you go, be prepared. An example that was provided was a really collaborative approach that worked well and that was really successful. And then through conversation too, I heard that drawing on your connections and your relationships, like drawing on those strengths. Yeah. And I heard talk about going at your outside connections, using those.
Part of that research, yeah. And sometimes you're better off calling a halt to the decision making if you don't have the right information, rather than making a poor decision and having to go back and revisit, yeah. Thanks. Thank you. Breakout group number 1. Number 2 is Bart, Janet, and Nigel. Do one of you want to share?
One of the things that I can't remember who mentioned was that their board was made up with people from other boards, so they really drew on their experience. From the board I'm on, we form subcommittees, and those people can really dig deep in and bring back a lot of really useful information and their recommendations on a decision before we decide as a whole. And we talked about, what's our role as a secretary in decision making, and one of the things you can do is really making getting it very clear so that we can write it down. But we had a little gem that's probably not anything to do with decision making, but I want to share. And I think it was from Nigel on Sport Northland. They somehow we got talking about the types of people on the board. They set up the scheme where they had interns on the board. Like we were talking about succession and getting more people involved. And I really liked it. This person can get some involvement. We want to get some younger people on our board, but they have no responsibilities. You can make it a limited time frame, but you're introducing more people into it, and some of them are going to stick around. So I just thought that was an intern project. I like that.
That's really good. Thank you. Thanks, Janet. Okay, room 3 was Rhonda, Darwin, Nolene and Sean. One of you want to share? Thanks, Rhonda.
Oh, okay. Yep. So we consider other options, you know, as a thing that we thought about was to consider other options before you go, you know, instead of just having, you know, this is it, but you can consider other options. Okay.
Yep.
That was something that Darwin brought up. Information prior, you know, to the meetings, like good information. So when you go in, you're not going to have any surprises, and so that you can participate, I guess, in the discussion. Not necessarily a time frame, you know, when you've got discussions that need more time, like don't rush it, like maybe you can pause and then you know, like have another discussion and then go back again, and then, you know, be honest and, you know, have consensus there.
Yeah. And I like that, asking the question, are there any other options before we make a decision? Have we considered all the options available to us? Sometimes that will just stretch people a little bit more. Thanks for that, team. Breakout room 4, Gordon, Heather, Linda. Any of you like to share?
Heather, do you want to share your examples? We talked about, you know, again, it was the same, having the right information so that everyone is well informed about it beforehand, not making rash decisions or quick decisions because there are deadlines. Have we considered everything? So much the same as everyone else is talking about it. Heather, you had a good example about decisions that have been made.
Museum needing some alterations done, and after a lot of discussion and everyone having their opinions, and it was decided that we really needed to rebuild, not just tweak the existing model. But that took many, many months to come to that. A lot of discussion. It wasn't a sudden decision. But we made sure everybody had their say. Everybody was quite clear what they were supporting.
Some decisions shouldn't be rushed, yeah? Thanks, guys. Breakout room 5, Kitty, Rosemary and Shannon.
We talked about the need for good preparation prior to the meeting, sticking to the topic, because it's so easy just to, you know, go hurtling off down side tracks. What else did we do? Oh, let everyone talk in the meeting so that everyone gets heard.
Yep.
And I found in my experience that there are some members who I know are really quiet, but if you pop round and have a coffee with them ahead of time, listen to what they think about an issue that needs a decision made, then even if they don't say anything, want to say anything in the meeting, you can say, oh, when we talked, Sarah, you know, you said, do you mind if I tell them about what you thought? And then it just prompts everyone to be more actively engaged in the decision-making process.
That's a good tip, yeah? And also you asking that question beforehand probably warms them up to thinking about it, and they probably will speak up at the meeting, yeah? Yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks, Rosemary. Okay, the next room is breakout room 6. Ashley, Cher, Lee, and Laiji. One of you want to jump in and share?
We talked about a number, or actually good and bad decision making, but I shared with the group, because I'm on a regional board, all the members are come from other clubs, are representing clubs. And so often when we're going into a decision, we are going to make a decision that's going to go impact back onto the clubs. So we have to declare our conflict of interest at the beginning. So before we declare it at the beginning, and it's quite up front there, right at the beginning of the meeting, or before we go into the subject. We've had a number of discussions around whether, if you have a conflict of interest, whether you can participate in the thing. But we've talked that through, and I think we've come to the conclusion that even though you have a conflict of interest, it doesn't mean to say that you can't actually give some input to the decision making or to the discussion, but you may not be able to make, participate at the final vote.
Yeah, but you have a perspective that could be valuable. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Hey, thanks, Lee. Okay, almost there. Breakout room 7. Joe, Pauline, and Sophia.
Yes, I'll talk then if nobody else is.
Thanks, Joe.
We talked about quite a few different things. The need for good information to be distributed before meetings. For myself, we've used a whiffle stick in a meeting, which keeps people more on track, but it also gives the opportunity for every single person at the table to have input on the decisions. At times we've used timers as well, especially when you're trying to get consensus, so that you can go back and look at what everybody's agreed at and the things that they haven't, and what needs further discussion to try and make meetings not be 5-6 hours sometimes when you've got more than one thing that needs to be decided on at the end of the day. But yeah, I found the whiffle stick worked quite well versus a waffle stick. And
can you explain that to us?
A whiffle is short, a waffle is very long.
Right, and it's a stick. Is it a literal stick you have?
A literal stick, yeah, it was very colourful, and you had your say on the topic, shared what you needed to share about whatever the decision was going to be, what extra information you had, and then when you had your say, you passed it on to the next person, so that everybody got the opportunity to speak, because there's always, as been mentioned, the quieter ones that don't always speak up unless they're actually physically given that opportunity to do it.
And I'm picking a whole stick that you have to pass on. Just increases your self-awareness that others need to speak.
Yeah, and then the timer was really there mostly to control the ones that still couldn't cope with a whiffle.
Yeah. And finally, Jan and Marjorie, anything that you guys talked about that hasn't been mentioned yet?
Going around in a group, going around the table and asking everyone, and if someone said no, to actually ask them to explain why they didn't agree.
Yep.
I thought that was a really good idea.
Yeah, and because that stops groupthink, that actually you have to consider that there are some alternative viewpoints that that will help us to make good decisions.
New ideas possible. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's part of the debating process, So thanks, everyone. I'm just going to share with you a model that will help us as chairpersons with that toing and froing in that debating process. And it's looking at what we call divergent versus convergent thinking. So divergent thinking is when we get people to put their ideas out there as far and as wide as we can, to really think of different options and alternative points of view. Convergent thinking is when we get people to start to synthesize and summarize the thinking to the point where we can get a decision. And what it looks like when we're chairing a decision-making process is that we start out in what we call the divergent zone. So we have our new topic of conversation, what it is we want to talk about, and we invite people to have diverse perspectives and to give alternative viewpoints on what the issue is that's being discussed. And then what happens is we have what we call a groan zone. So the groan zone is the toing and the froing. So this is the debating zone. And this is actually a really healthy place to be, because at this point we're starting to weigh pros and cons, and we're weighing different perspectives against each other and coming up with different alternatives that we could possibly do. But the thing for most of us is we don't want to have those 6-hour meetings that Joe mentioned. So at a certain point, we have to bring the decision-making into what we call the convergent zone. And that's starting to get closure and starting to synthesize people's ideas so that we get to a point where we can actually vote on something if voting is the process, or we can agree that we have consensus. So when we're chairing this process, or we're facilitating this process, the skill is to keep people in the groan zone long enough that we get really good points of view and really good debate happening, but not keeping in there so long that people start to drift off and not care about the issue anymore. But also to make sure that we do get into that convergent zone, because we can't actually make a good decision until we start to come into that convergent thinking. All we've discussed, everything we've looked at, how do we bring that down to inform the decision that we're going to make? And so I find this a useful picture to keep in my head when I'm watching discussions happening. Like, where are we in the process from introducing our topic to actually making our decision? What does it look like? So I just wanted to share that with you. So team, we've finished looking at the 4 C's compass for chairpersons. So it's about clarity of purpose. It's about building a cohesive board, building a cohesive team of people working together. It's about fostering constructive relationships inside and outside of the organisation, and also ensuring that we have considered decision making. So if we create a job description for ourselves, or what is our responsibility and the purpose of us as chairpersons, those 4 areas can give us a good framework to work from. But I just want to check in on meetings, because it's at meetings where boards actually do most of their work. And most chairpersons, their key job is to facilitate meetings. And I like to talk about the 4 P's of effective meetings. So the 4 things that we need to make sure that we have in place for meetings to have good outcomes and for people to feel good about being part of the process. And the first one is about knowing why you're having the meeting, the purpose of the meeting, how we know we'll be successful. The second is about having good preparation. And a few of you talked about that before, and the decision making is about being prepared with information to be able to make good decisions. Are the right people at this meeting, people with the authority to make the decisions present? Nothing worse than actually having to halt everything and postpone a process until another time because someone can't be there. So if key people can't be there, better to reschedule. And the process, what's on the agenda and how will we ensure that all participants contribute? So we're just going to run through these quickly. And the first one is a good way to make sure that we have clear purpose is to have good meeting outcome statements. And sometimes these are quite good to write down on our agendas. What is it that we want to achieve? What has to be accomplished? And when it's over, how will we know it's been a success? So this is a good, nice checklist for us as chairs or as facilitators to make sure that we're able to keep people on track and that we achieve what we set out to achieve. Most times when I hear complaints about meetings and people saying that meetings are really boring and they feel disengaged from the board, it's because they say that the meetings meander and they're not actually sure what the purpose of the meeting is. This is just a deal with cartoon about preparation, meeting preparation, and how many times people on boards that I work with complain that board members don't read reports before they come, that they just rock up to the meeting, which means the first part of the meeting is having to go over all of the information that they should have come with before. And I think that the question for us as chairpersons, what gets in the way of our board being prepared and what can be done to alleviate this? So little things like, are we actually providing the information far enough in advance for people to be able to read it? Are the reports and the information we're providing just like screeds and screeds of information that people have to hunt through to find the information, or are we better off just giving people bullet points? So if your board is showing up unprepared, it's a good question to ask. What can we do why is it that they're unprepared? Why are they not committing? And also what can we do to alleviate this, rather than just saying, oh, that board member's not really meeting up to the expectations that we think that they should. Again, it's about having the right people present, making sure that decisions can get made. And finally, making sure that we have good process. So it's about having good decision-making processes in advance. And so if we know that we have to go to a vote, what does a vote look like? Having that prepared as a facilitator. Or are we having consensus processes? What kind of consensus process will I facilitate? We need to absolutely try to avoid groupthink. So groupthink is where everybody just agrees right off the bat, yep, that's the solution, that's the decision we're going to make, without going through some of the tools that you all talked about, yeah, like the waffle stick or the doing the rounds to make sure everybody's contributing. And one of you mentioned like really respecting alternative viewpoints and people that are saying no, like really digging through what is it that they see that we're not seeing. And one of the best ways to decide our process is to have a really good agenda, and I'll just talk about agendas in a minute. But the other is also about making sure that we have full participation, and a few of you talked to some really good ideas on how to make sure we have participation. And I think facilitating meetings is, we sometimes talk about facilitation as like a duck, that when you look at a duck swimming on the water, they look cool, calm and collected, but underneath the surface, their legs are going like crazy as they swim. And that's what it's like to be a facilitator, yeah? On the surface, we're participating in discussions, we're watching discussions happen. Underneath, we're making sure that everybody's participating, that we're on track with time, and that we're sticking to the purpose that we set out to achieve. So I just want to talk briefly about agendas, and this is a typical standard business agenda that we see quite often at not-for-profits, and you might recognise it, the calling to order, apologies, minutes, matters arising, correspondence, then we do some reports, then we do some motions, and then we get to some general business, and then we close our meetings. There's a pretty general kind of misunderstanding in some areas that this is somehow some kind of legal obligation you have to have your agendas that look like this. There is no rule or law anywhere in Aotearoa New Zealand that says not-for-profit agendas need to look like this, and this is the order that you do things. When we have all those minutes and matters arising and reports at the beginning, it's a little bit life-sucking for us. So what happens when we get to the interesting stuff, the motions and the general business, quite often we've either run out of time or we've run out of energy or interest. So we really recommend that when we put our agendas together that we flip them, yeah? So that actually we talk about the interesting things at the beginning, and that we look at the minutes and matters arising and tally up the things that we didn't do at the last meeting towards the end of the meeting. We also suggest having an agenda where it's really clear which each of the agenda items, the purpose for it, and letting people know up front why we've got this on the agenda, which really means that people can warm up to what they're there for. Having a process is really useful for not only you as facilitator, but for everybody else, because they know what's expected of them. So we have 3 types of process generally in a meeting. One is that we need a decision to be made. So if an agenda item says we need a decision, then I know that as a board member contributing to the discussion, at a certain point I'm going to have to vote on something, or we're going to have to come to a consensus. Sometimes we have things at our meeting that are just for discussion. We just want to gather information, we want to hear different points of view, but we don't have to come to some kind of decision at the end. And that's okay, just to have a discussion item, because quite often the people who are working on that issue want to hear information to support what they're doing, and possibly come back later with something that needs a decision. And the last one is just about information. Is this just a piece of information for the board that the board needs to know? There's no need for us to spend time discussing it. We don't have to make a decision. It's just really important that we know it. And to have the timing there, because when we start to put timing next to agenda items, we realize that actually our meetings are going to be 6 hours long. and that we can then start to prioritize what we want to have in our agenda to make sure that we do the really important stuff, that we really make sure that we're there to make decisions. Because the purpose of coming together in a meeting is to do something that one person can't do on their own. And usually that's about making decisions and having robust conversations around what we need to do to move ahead. So sometimes things like coordinators' reports, you could just say, like on this agenda, does anyone have any questions or concerns? We don't have to have the coordinator reading out every item and us all going through it. So I'm actually on an international board who's chaired by a ex-New York congresswoman, and she's a lawyer, ex-lawyer. So she's quite, you can imagine, she's quite a feisty, ruthless type of chairperson. And the first time I went to my meeting on this board, and you can imagine it's people from all over the world, Africa, all places in Europe, Southern Hemisphere. Yeah, we're all in the room together. I thought, I'm really interested how she's going to facilitate this process. And she said before the first meeting that there is an expectation that you will have all read the papers before you come to this meeting. And we will not discuss any information that's in the papers unless you have a question. And at that first meeting, it became really evident who hadn't read the information, because people started to ask questions, and her reply was, that piece of information is already in the report, you need to have read the report. And I can tell you that at the second meeting, everybody had read everything, yeah? And she was quite rigid on it, she was quite strict on it, and people really knew, here's the expectations of me to be on this meeting. But when we allow people to want to rehash reports and to go over stuff that everyone's already read, that's the stuff that's demotivating. So we have to set the expectations, set the standards that we want for people. Okay, this is just a little bit about agendas. And just finally also talking about that participation as a purpose of the meeting, yeah? Otherwise, like I said, we could just have one person making all the decisions on behalf of us, but full participation is a purpose. And I know that you've all been to meetings where there's a meeting in the car park after the meeting. That meeting usually happens because people feel that they weren't heard in the meeting, and that they feel that there wasn't full participation and good decision making happening. So if you're part of a board that meets afterwards in the car park, possibly a good time for you all to have a conversation. What is it about our meeting process that we don't achieve our business during the time? So just before we finish, I just want to do a final plea for chairpersons, like before you've had enough. I know some people who end up being chairpersons for years and years on boards because there's no one to take over, and they say, I don't want to do this anymore, but nobody steps up. So 3 things I think that enable us to be able to leave with our sanity and with our dignity is, first of all, have a clear definition of the role. So when we put it out there, I don't want to be chairperson anymore, it's time for someone else to take a turn. People really know what the role looks like and what they're committing to. To have a development process built into your role as chairperson. So one of the good things about being a chair is you actually do learn a lot. So I think it's really useful for us as chairs to have goals at the beginning of our term to say, what do I want to get out of this job? Because if I'm not being fed being a chairperson, then it's just a chore. And literally by the end of it, you've lost all your passion for the cause, for the organisation, and for everything you do. So really define what it is that you want to get out of it and build in a learning process for yourself. And also define a process of succession, yeah? The very first day you take on a role as chair, start picking who you want to take over from you. So some organisations have a deputy chairperson's role, and the job of the deputy chairperson is to get ready to be the next chairperson. And I just think that's a wonderful system. The board I'm in, we actually went out and recruited some young people to bring them on into the board because we felt we wanted to have a bit more youth representation, but we also wanted a young person to chair. So we actually spent a good couple of years training her in governance and sending her to training on facilitation so that she could take over as a chair. So having someone in hand to take over from you. So you're not at an AGM and no one's stepping forward, you've got a person all primed up and enthusiastic. So I'm just going to stop sharing there. So we just have a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Quick questions?
Yeah, Sandy.
Yep.
Just in a couple of situations where you had motions on the table, some people opened up a discussion on an issue, and then at the end, the motion, the second, and the vote happened. To cut kind of, to get to the point earlier, could you kind of, someone said, look, you should actually, before you start talking, put the motion, the second, then discuss, and then vote after that. So it kind of keeps things moving versus that dragging it out. So I just wanted to check with you on that issue. Kind of the motion and the second first, or
I think we put our motion first because that keeps us focused on what we're discussing. And so once we start to drift off, we can say, hang on a minute, we're talking about this motion that's on the table right now. And maybe take a note of the other discussions and then come back to them later. But if it's not informing the motion, then now's not the time for us to be discussing this. Usually
keeps everybody on point.
Keeps everyone on point, and usually we get the mover and the seconder up front because traditionally they introduce the motion and they would have the final word as well. So it depends how formal you are in your organisation. There's also no law that you have to have movers and seconders in motions. In fact, there's no law you even have to have official motions, except some of the funders, like the gambling, the pokey machines and funders like that, like to see formal motions, so that they can see that it was done that way.
Okay.
Anyone else?
It was suggested once to me that, you know, if you've got the motion on the floor and as chair, you can get the sense that everybody's in favour of it or against it. You don't have to keep going around and around. You just go to the vote.
Exactly. If you have, you know, if you think that the information that everyone has been given is enough and it's not controversial, you don't have to, and depending on the issue, if it's a vote about where we're going to have our Christmas party, it's like we don't have to talk about that for hours,
No.
If it's something huge, like buying a building, actually now we want to talk about this for quite a while. So that's called spontaneous agreement in facilitation talk. But if you have spontaneous agreement, we don't have to believe,
Excuse me, I have a question. So once you've made a motion, like, can you cancel that motion the next day? Like out of the meeting, like you've had the meeting, moved a motion, say example here is moved a motion for payment of an account, and then the next day you've decided, oh no, I didn't want that motion?
Nah. Once a motion has been made by the group, then that motion stands. If you have a piece of information the next day that they should have known when they made that decision, you could possibly go back to them and say, hey, we didn't know this when we made that decision, but so it's up, the whole group has to say the motion is no longer valid.
We've just had one trustee who's who came to a meeting, and then after, like, we've had, you know, good dialogue and participation and everything, decided that he wanted to suspend everything that was said at that meeting. So does that make it a no quorum now?
If it's one person making a decision, then there isn't a quorum and it's not a legal decision. Okay, so the only decisions that are legal are those that are made by that group of people in your trust deed or your constitution.
Oh yes, yeah, that's what it was. It was we all made the decisions and made the motions and all that. But
one person can't overturn that, no.
Oh, okay.
You have to go back to the whole group.
Oh, that's good.
Sometimes one person, like I said, might get a piece of information that should have been shared at the time. So coming back and revisiting decisions isn't always the worst thing in the world. Anyone else? Thanks, Rhonda.
Sandy, when it goes to general business, can it then, how do you distinguish between general business discussion and then also motions and putting things on the table and allowing just general chit chat versus actually kind of, no, let's stick to point, go blah, like putting a motion forward?
So your motions is usually the bit of your agenda, the topics that you've agreed you're going to talk about that night. General business is decided usually at the beginning of the meeting. Does anyone have any general business they want to raise? And we'll put it on the agenda. So if you get to general, at that point at the beginning of the meeting, you've kind of just added a little bit to the agenda. Because otherwise, you'll never finish. People are always
Yeah,
that they bring up. Yeah.
Like tonight.
Yeah, it's quite good to at the beginning agree what goes under general business, and because your general business might only have 15, 20 minutes, you have to prioritize what you'll talk about. Yeah.
Excuse me, Sandy.
Yes.
Latu. Is there a rule book for, you know, to guide you through how to engage correctly in meetings?
So there's this thing called Robert's Rules of Order.
Yeah, yeah.
It was created way back in the day where there was all sorts of men in funny wigs on the side of the Thames making decisions. And so the Robert's Rules of Order was created for parliamentary debate. And so a lot of large or formal organisations will adopt those rules for running their meetings, but they are actually quite stifling. They aren't designed for participation. They aren't designed for consensus decision making. They're designed for a whole bunch of people to have formal debates in Parliament. So there are a lot of books. Ingrid Benz, I-N-G-R-I-D, Ingrid Benz, B-E-N-S. She has written some excellent books on facilitation and meeting management, so I highly recommend her work. But the internet is full of stuff, yeah? And can I say that in the last 6 weeks, a lot of people have released a lot of stuff for free. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I would tend to decide amongst yourselves what you want your meeting process to be. So come up with your own rules. Come up with your own rules of order. What works for you?
Okay.
There is no law that says that you have to run your meetings in a certain way. It has to work for you.
Yeah, I suppose I was just interested in Rhonda's corridor around, you know, rescinding of motions, and just wanted to get some clarity around, you know, rules.
And we don't have to have motions. Yeah, and particularly Pacifica and Māori groups, totally different processes to, you know, a group that you might find in, I don't know, the middle of Remuera. Yeah, it's like you have to do what's right for your community and what's right for your board. Come up with your own rules.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because starting from the outset, having that discussion, placing it on a table. Okay, so how do we want to run our processes? And you know, and we do that as Māori and Pacific on, like you have that corridor.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we want to engage going forward and make our decisions? What's our tikanga, what's our kaupapa? Yeah.
Sure. And then everybody owns that process, yeah, and they will make it work. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Sandy, are there any specific rules around voting? So, like, say you've got 2 positions going and they might put forward 5 people are nominated, and then some of, say, the clubs are voting twice for the same person instead of voting for 2 different people. How can you get around that?
First of all, you need to look at your constitution or your trust deed, yeah, and see what it says. So at all times, if your trust deed or your constitution has anything about voting or meeting process, those are your rules, you have to follow them. Second to your trust deed and your constitution are your policies and your bylaws. So you can create policies around voting and what is and isn't acceptable for your organisation. So it's kind of like a more formal thing that Anna-Latu was just talking about. It's about creating a policy or a bylaw that formalises what you can and can't do around voting. So if your constitution, your trust deed's not clear, and you're the type of organisation that has a lot of different people with diverse views, sometimes it pays to have a policy. And boards can write policies, and boards can change policies without having to go through a constitutional change.
Okay. Does it have to go for a vote of the wider members?
No.
Okay.
A board can do that. Yeah.
Cool.
Sandy, what's the story? Oh, sorry. What's the story around correspondence? Like how?
So correspondence is a throwback of the old days when people used to write letters, and you probably only had 10 letters a week. But nowadays, a lot of correspondence is virtual, and communication is not as formal as it used to be. So unless you're a really small organisation with a volunteer who's talking to people and you want to keep track of who they're talking to, you don't have to have correspondence, yeah?
Do you send it out, like as chairperson, if you get some emails in, do you have to send it out to everyone when it comes in?
That's the kind of stuff that you need to agree as a board up front. What's your expectations around what the chairperson communicates? So some chairpersons communicate everything because they're highly collaborative. Some organisations are a bit too large for that, and so will just communicate on really important issues that they want to get board feedback. Can I say that sometimes when chairpersons are dealing with tricky situations, like conflict in staff, or there's something going on with a funder or an external stakeholder, you need to bring your board around you. Yeah. And in those times, if you feel like you don't have the mandate, or it's not a clear decision that you can make as chairperson, bring your team around you to talk it through. Yeah.
It's more like some on our little committee seem to think that as soon as you get an email in, I'm meant to send it out to everybody, and if I'm not doing that, then I'm not keeping them informed.
I think you need to agree as a group what you want to be informed about.
Yeah.
Otherwise your inboxes are going to get clogged and people are going to disengage. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. But there's no rules. It's the answer.
There's no rules.
Most questions is it depends, eh?
Yeah, Sandy, I've just got one thing there. With this COVID lockdown, it tends to be that meetings have been cancelled and a massive email discussion starts where we've sort of lost control of everything. What's your feelings about that? When we hold meetings, or should it all be going through the chair?
I find that if you're doing virtual meetings via like email, it's always useful to have one person moderating the conversation so that they're summarising and making sure that people are being heard and that their viewpoints are being considered. I think most boards that I've worked with in the last 6 weeks have very quickly got on board with Zoom, and are able to have virtual meetings. Then charities, the company's office changed the laws to say that you can have virtual meetings, like on Zoom during COVID crisis, even if your constitution doesn't say that you can. But you need to check that constitution, because if your constitution after this says that you have to meet face to face, then you really should. And if you've done a lot of decision making that way, just via email, when you all get back together for a meeting, it's probably best just to do a quick review of the decisions that were made during lockdown to make sure that everything was done properly, yeah? Yeah, but to have email conversations is not the most efficient way, unless you have a good moderator, yeah. And Zoom is pretty intuitive, eh? Most people are okay with it, yeah. Just need a little bit of training, a little bit of practice. And I know a lot of boards have decided that even after COVID, they're going to stay having Zoom board meetings. They're like, I don't have to drive across town in the dark. This is great. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, but do you have anything you want, final words?
Final words. Well, good session. I see someone.
Oh, we just got.
You have to unmute yourself.
Hey, okay. So can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Just a really quick question. I'm sorry I was late. AGMs. We've deferred our AGM, and the final date is June 29. What's your advice on? I mean, it's all a bit hypothetical because we don't know if it'll be more than 10, but it's looking like it's probably not practical to hold a physical AGM. What's the best solution here, please? And it's possibly not Zoom, Sandy, because we have a vast mix of members, and
I'm pretty sure we're allowed to delay our AGMs because of COVID, and charities won't deregister anyone for being late or penalise anyone for being late. So you can delay.
Okay, so they're delaying it more than the normal 3 months. Okay.
I'm not sure how long we have though. I don't think they've given a deadline because no one really knows. Yeah.
So just don't have it at the moment.
Yeah, just postpone it. But you know, it won't be long, right? I believe that today 100 people are allowed to meet, yeah?
Oh, right.
So it won't be long.
They've lifted the number to 100 today, as
Yeah.
of Friday.
Right, still with physical distancing and stuff though. Yeah.
So you'll need a big hall.
Yeah. Okay, well, right, that changes things then. Cool, thank you.
But I honestly don't think it's going to be too long before we're all back mixing and mingling.
Yeah.
In terms
Sure.
of AGM length of time, yeah.
Okay. Yes, because I have a car and the Want of Fitness expired in March, but I have till October 10. So,
yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sandy. Very interesting and good meeting. Also looking at the chat box for those who had to go already. So in 2 weeks, June 8th, it's the next one. And then we are, and then it's the next one is July, August, because this was number 8 of 14. So some of you might already have earned a certificate. Just let us know. Okay, so that was it for tonight, and see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.